Hi, I'm Shelley, a business analyst, and this is a conversation I've had many times in my career, so I thought it might be helpful to capture it and share it. And basically, it's about business process models. What do they mean, and what does a good one look like? So I wanted to talk about a way of representing processes or things that get done. So they might be called business process models, swim lane diagrams. Sometimes a collection of these type of diagrams is known as a business blueprint. I'm going to talk about the purpose of creating this video, then go through what goes into a business process model, and then talk about the features of a good model. So, the purpose of this presentation. This presentation is an explanation of the components of a business process diagram for someone who hasn't ever seen one. But it's also a description of what makes a diagram clear and concise, and that's for people who might be creating them, so people like business analysts. It's based on my decades of experience in business analysis, which followed on from decades of experience in possibly not that long in programming. But I did want to point out that what it's not is a definitive statement of the strict business process modeling notation. So there are some things that I do that are a little bit different that I have found to be more helpful. And it's definitely not the only way to create a clear and concise business process diagram. It's also not the only way that I create a clear and concise business process diagram. It's just a sort of general, these are the kind of things that I've noticed. So let's start talking about the components of a model. So what does it look like? Here we have a very basic process flow to illustrate a few points in general, and then I'll go in a bit more depth later. So as you can see, this is a help desk, a general sort of maybe computer help desk. As you can see, the user might call in with an issue, and then they'll be met with a help desk operator who goes through an initial script. And then, you know, they're trying to initially resolve the issue. And then if they have resolved it, well, that's great. But if not, then they will need to refer it on, and it ends up being transferred over to a technical expert who will also resolve the issue. And ultimately, the notification goes back to the user that it was resolved. Now, obviously, this is really basic. It doesn't account for things like what if it can't be resolved? You know, what if it's a bit more complex than that? But I just wanted to make it a really simple process in order to give the general idea of what we're talking about. So let's start by talking about those different components. First of all, we have that start and end. So we've got the trigger that initially kicks off the process, and then the terminating point to say, yep, that event has finished, that process has finished. The guts of a process flow are the individual processes within it. These are the steps that you are taking to fulfill the process. Each process or task should be a verb phrase because it's representing an action. So here we've got administer script or refer on or resolve issue. So they start with a verb, that they're a verb phrase. It's probably worth mentioning at this point the arrows between them. They're fairly self-explanatory and they show you the order in which processes occur. So, and each of these processes could in theory be drilled down into, I'll demonstrate that later, where you break it down into its component parts. Often when that's happened, you would actually see here you would actually see a little plus sign to notify you that it's been drilled down into. The trouble with that is that I often find I'm building out models progressively, and often they, not so much these days, but once upon a time, they would need to be published and printed and everything. So if you were to be building out your model progressively and you decide to drill down into a process, you're going to have to go back to that higher level process every time you flesh out a particular sub-process to say, oh, this one's been drilled down into now. So for that reason, I tend to be guided by the features of the project I'm working on as to whether I include that little plus sign to say that it's been drilled down into. There's pros and cons. Now, I'm sure you've already gathered the next thing I'm going to talk about is the decision point. These ones are best phrased as a question, but it's often hard to fit all that information into the diamond and keep it legible. So basically here we've got this, it's just a single word, but it's like, has it been resolved? And if it has been, then you go straight to notifying the user. If it hasn't been resolved, then you have to refer on. So it doesn't have to be yes or no questions. It might be, which type of product is this? Or which type of issue? Is it hardware, software, or user question, or something like that? So that's what a decision point is, and then from then you go to one of the paths to follow through. I mentioned earlier that this type of process flow is often called a swim lane diagram, and that's because it looks a little bit like a swimming pool split up into lanes, swim lanes. So this particular one is showing you that all the activities in that middle swim lane are the responsibility of the help desk operator. Often you'll find that if you drill down into a process that other people do need to do stuff, but the role that's in that swim lane is the role that has the responsibility for it being completed. So that's another piece of information that you've got in the components of a swim lane diagram. I really wasn't sure whether I should put this in the features of a good model or the components of a model, but here it is in the components of a model. Basically, there's another piece of information on here over and above the components on the page, and that's time. So if you draw your model with time as the x-axis, you can easily see at a glance the order in which things happen. So you can easily see at a glance, in this case, that notifying the user happens after resolving the issue, for example. Now, it can be really tempting to try and squish more information onto the screen. So you might let that resolve decision drop straight down into the refer on decision, but then you've actually lost a piece of information. In this case, if you're using time as the dimension, then two processes being level with each other on that x-axis, that horizontal, that means that they're happening at the same time. And so moving on to that, here's a few things that in my training and experience make for a good model, good diagram. It's all about making it easy to read. The first thing is to have about 5 items on the page. So this makes it easy to take in all that information at a glance. If you find that there are a lot more steps, then it might be a good idea to bundle those steps into a single process and then drill down into that. So in this case, administer script, that might have a whole heap of other steps in it. As you can see, administer script occurs after the user calls in with an issue, and the thing that comes out of that is whether or not it's resolved that decision point. So then when we go down into that administered script, we can see that these are the steps that happen within administer script. So that happen after the user calls with an issue and before you make the decision as to whether it's been resolved. So you might get the details from the client and then ask for the universal fix. Have you tried turning it off and on again? Then maybe look at some known issues and resolutions and then check the knowledge base. So some packages such as Signavio will actually allow you in that higher level to say, I want to open this up and create, the detail of it, which might be a process flow like we've got here, or it might just be, well, actually, this is now just a script I need to go through. So it's like step 1, step 2, step 3. So you can actually open it up into a set of written steps. But here you can see how that first bit, the user calls with an issue, and the bit that comes after, whether it's resolved, is included here in this process flow. Now look, that rule about 5 items is not universal. It is just a rule of thumb. In some situations, it works really well to be able to see everything. I have worked on many projects that end up being a complete massive wall-sized poster customer journey that people find really helpful to go to. It's just a good rule of thumb to follow in a lot of cases. So the last good rule of thumb to follow is in how you order these swim lanes. So if you have a look at this diagram, the top swim lane is the customer, so the really front facing. Then you go to the front of desk operator, and then as you go down the page, you go deeper again to that sort of technical expert. So on that vertical, it's actually about how deep you go into the organisation. In some cases, and not so much these days, in some business blueprints I've seen, the bottom swim lane will actually be the system that's being worked on. So you kind of go deeper, deeper, deeper until you're actually talking to the machine or the infrastructure even. I think the reason it's less common these days is that sort of systems support all these functions. So they're represented at those higher levels too. It's not meaningful to sort of go, oh, we go deeper, 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 then we're talking to the machine. But if we go back to the point, if you combine that depth dimension on the y-axis with the time dimension that we talked about earlier when we were talking about components, then you end up with kind of a bit of a U shape. If you have a look here, how they follow a bit of a U shape. So it goes, from that higher level of the customer, goes deeper and deeper into the organization and then comes back out again. So again, this is giving you information that you can see at a glance. And one of the reasons why this is actually really helpful to see, because I have seen it happen before, is where you will have something like this and the process is such that under some circumstances, the user doesn't end up getting notified as to what's resolved. So you might have resolved the situation, but you haven't gone back to the user. So having that time dimension and how deep you've gone into the organization is a way of easily seeing at a glance that yes, this goes back to the user. The user does end up getting some information out of this at the time. So it hasn't kind of gone into this black hole never to be seen again. So that's a reason why that U shape is really helpful, to be able to just see at a glance, yep, yeah, this is going back to the next stage. So yeah, look, I hope this has been helpful for you. That's just, like I say, my experience. All the best.